Sego, everyone. We're going to do our introductions, but I just really want to take a moment to really ride in on the beautiful space and sound wave that was created right before here to bring ourselves together in a moment of reverence. I know we've been listening to so many brilliant Indigenous humans here gathering in this learning circle today. And I just want to take a moment to presence ourselves and ground ourselves here in this moment to really center the First Nations people of Turtle Island, imagining this beautiful mycelial web of kinship and relation across this beautiful continent upon many of us live and reside and work and love and create. And I would love to imagine ourselves in this place that we know as Turtle Island, and imagine that there are no false borders, that those who seek to create these political divisions between us to the north and to the south, but instead there's a beautiful mycelial kinship web that stretches from coast to coast, from east to west and north to south. And so I'm welcoming in all of our Indigenous participants and listeners and community, as well as, and may we call all of our ancestors close. I know I'm calling mine in close today and every day. And may we be reminded of the strength and resilience that they planted deep in our body so that we could continue to rise up in this dignified resurgence that is happening today in our communities and in this upon this continent. And for those of you who are listening who are perhaps not Indigenous to this continent, but who are living in one form of diaspora or another, I welcome you into to gather as we all reckon with this current cultural insanity that we're all immersed in right now. And may we call on those long ago ancestors that you have and who have a deep memory and remembrance of what it means to live in a kincentric way, you know, with our kins at the center. So I just have a short poem I want to read to sort of bring us in. I just am so excited to get to conversate with Chris, and I know we have a lot that we really want to dive into, but I just really want to set the foundation of our conversation and use this opportunity to invoke and call in those ancestors, those ones that have recently departed and those long ago ones that can come here and join us as we create a vision for how our blood memory can guide us and how we can reimagine what a relational foodscape might look like. So it was once said, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know that we were seeds. All of the generations of people who came before us, who in their own ways prayed for the sprouting of our deeply connected lifeways again. We return with our beautiful children in hand to the traditional earth-based ways of our people, perhaps the first in many generations in our bloodlines to follow the sacred ceremonial calendar again, renewing time-honored relationships with all around us, eating our traditional foods and caring for our seed relatives. These ancestors, they prayed for us in many ways, in diverse tongues, and in small, humble, everyday ceremonies of patting babies to sleep, of stirring the cooking pot and sitting in the shade of an oak tree to make a basket, of rowing such baskets across the mighty rivers to market. We hear them in the songs that honored the births and the deaths, the planting and the harvests. These prayers of our ancestors, in their own special ways, sowed seeds of resilience and vitality that they knew would take a few generations of laying dormant in the dark soil of our hearts, carried down through our blood memory in the rivers of our mother's sweet womb water that is held in the little pools in our spine and in our veins and in our marrow. 7 generations or more These seeds of prayers were tucked into the safety of the soil of our underground mycelia of cultural and ancestral memory, tucked deep into the earth that is our own bodies, connected through tributaries of rivers, of bloodlines and lineages. These seeds are finally sprouting in their own time. The seeds enduring the scarification and weathering of decades of struggles and challenges, and also the spirit fire of our mothers and grandmothers' tenacity for ensuring that our lifeways stay alive amidst the confusion. What they endured so that we could be here today alive, tending these shiny-faced green sprouts of life that they so diligently tucked into the safety of our bodies, hidden from hungry and greedy hands, until generations later, they could emerge with renewed vigor and vibrancy. It was such scarification that has given the prayers the courage to sprout into our lives today. We are their wildest dreams, sprouting and coming to life, because they tried to bury us, but they did not know that we were seeds. Danito. So that's a piece that I wrote to honor this idea of blood memory. And I'll introduce myself, and then I'll hand it over to Chris to introduce himself. Sego, Seaguego, Ganyet Dahawe, Yungyat. My name's Rowen White. I come from a community called Akwesasne, which is a Mohawk community that spans the New York-Canadian border. I'm Snipe Clan. My Mohawk name means she carries the snow or brings the snow. And it's a real honor to be here. I'm a farmer, I'm a mother, I'm a seed keeper, I'm a storyteller, and I have the honor and privilege of working with a whole network of seed keepers, wisdom keepers, farmers, and land stewards through the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which is a program of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. And we currently reside here in Northern California on our family farm called Sierra Seeds. So it's a real honor to join a growing culture here again, and to sit alongside my my friend Chris. So I'll pass it over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Rowen. And I'm just going to introduce myself as the guy who has to follow that. Good luck to me. My name is Chris Newman. I'm a farmer, a land protector, a joker, and a rabble rouser out here near Washington, D.C. My people are the Chapteco Piscataway, indigenous to Southern Maryland, and we're part of a large tribal confederacy that extended from where I am now on the banks of the Potomac River all the way north of what is today called Washington, D.C., and where everyone's favorite citizen lives for hopefully less than 20 more days. So that's who I am. I'm helping create a collective of BIPOC farmers who are looking to steward under Indigenous management ethics, thousands of acres in our traditional homelands and beyond, to restore a direct food sovereignty to this region, as well as mount a direct challenge to conventional extractive agriculture and extractive agribusiness and food systems. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with Rowen, specifically around the incredibly rich vocabulary that she's developed to try to reclaim this conversation around environmental conservation, sustainable food systems, et cetera, because we tend to get lost in a discussion that's dominated by our oppressor and by our occupiers. So I wanted to start this off with an introduction just about the state of things we're in and why we're having this discussion. Landscapes on Turtle Island are undergoing change at a pace not seen since our homelands were first invaded. After thousands of years of overwhelmingly successful stewardship by Indigenous people, settler colonialism has managed to bring our relationship with the natural world to the brink of collapse in just 4 centuries. Today, apparently having learned very little, the various movements around sustainable agriculture and environmental conservation continue to center the discussion around market-based solutions promulgated by a white male hive mind that can only regard the natural world as an object at their service. One documentary, book, podcast, conference, essay, and article after another reinforces this extractive, hierarchical, and segregationist viewpoint of our relationship with the earth to the exclusion of all other viewpoints. Indigenous people find ourselves relegated to the margins, the natural Indian viewed as just another piece of nature to be placed in the service of white interests through appropriation and tokenization. We often find ourselves grasping for mainstream legitimacy by adopting the sustainability language of our oppressor, wrapping our lifeways into linguistic sugar pills like permaculture and regenerative agriculture in the hopes that white men will actually ingest a medicine as long as they feel they own and control it. But in this talk, we're going to try a different way with a new vocabulary for reclaiming the discussion around concepts of relational food systems, kinship economics, and blood memory. And in so doing, we dig deep into what our ancestors buried into the memory of our blood and bones and reclaim our vision of what foodways at scale can look like again here on Turtle Island. Rowen's people, the Haudenosaunee, and my people, the Piscataway, were complex political and kinship alliances that, nevertheless, managed to harvest millions of bushels of corn, rice, and beans, and uncountable tons of fish, game, and wild forage, while only enhancing the productivity of the landscape. And the critical question is, how do we blend our ancestral lifeways with new tools of the modern day to sprout a dignified food landscape that is just, equitable, and aligns with our cultural values? And with that, I'm just going to jump right into my first question with Rowen, which is, what does blood memory mean to you as it relates to the dignified resurgence of relational foodways? Why is this blood memory central to BIPOC leadership in reimagining our food landscape?
Great. Thanks, Chris. So I think a lot about blood memory as it relates to where we can dare to dream. I know that I have a very visceral understanding of what blood memory is because I too personally made this journey to find my way home through Food and Seed upon their invitation. When I was 17 years old, I was a young Mohawk woman who had really bore the brunt of generations of people in my family who had survived and succeeded under whiteness, but had really had much of the traditional life ways, the ceremonial ways, really stripped from them through the eras of boarding school. But there was a very visceral connection and drawing in of things that while they weren't directly given to me, I knew them, right? Like I have these memories of digging my hands into buckets of cornmeal in my mother's pantry. I would sneak in there and dig my hands into that cornmeal and loved that feeling of that silky corn on my skin. And what that brought, that sense of safety, that sense of wholeness, that sense of deep understanding that I would get when I would find my way in there. And I found my way to a farm when I was 17 and began to reclaim these ancestral seed bundles that had been lost in my own familial bloodlines. And as I began to grow these seeds, tend them and steward them, eat these beautiful corn beans and squash, they began to come inside my body and enliven and rehydrate this understanding of who I was as a Mohawk woman amidst, again, the cultural insanity of the current time. And it was, again, this very visceral understanding of this is not something new that I'm learning. It is a remembering, right, of putting the pieces back together. And so those cosmogenealogies, those kinship lines of me beginning to understand that I'm a direct lineal descendant of these plants that these ancestral seeds that I'm planting in my garden at that point, that would enliven a deeper understanding of the cosmologies of my people, of the creation stories and the ceremonial understandings of my people. that was this first glimpse into understanding how powerful blood memory is in the revitalization and the reclamation of these foods. And I've said this before, I think even here on Growing Culture, but I think it bears repeating, which is that the colonial forces that settled here and continue to perpetuate their systems of extraction and disconnection, they want us as Indigenous peoples to be defined by our intergenerational trauma and the loss and all of the things that they dismantled and took from us. But I stand here, and I know that you stand here, Chris, and many of those who are listening also stand here to invite all of us to remember our intergenerational creativity and our innovation and our resilience and our brilliance. And that, to me, is what the future of food looks like. And what I see, and so I know that that's a direct remembrance from the foodways of my ancestors. And that intactness of that cultural sanity of a beautiful relational food landscape is not so far away from my grasp. In fact, it can be rehydrated when I begin to taste those foods and share them in the Longhouse and share them in ceremony and in community. And what I began to really think about is that, we get very frustrated, as you mentioned, around the lack of centering BIPOC voices in thought leadership around reimagining our food landscape. And we see oftentimes this, just continual regurgitation of the same sort of like feudalistic, extractive means of growing our food, and in this idea of sort of, it's like an imperial construct of production and again, rooted in disconnection. And my faith in the future of food and in the future of food and nourishment that I want for my children and my grandchildren, it's an embodied landscape of storied. It's a storied landscape of food. It's where through eating and sharing food and growing food and sharing in our community that we have an understanding of our place in the world. And I feel that the time is now for us to center BIPOC voices in the reimagining, and not just centering our voices, but supporting us through resources, foundations, platforms, redistribution of wealth that supports not only the vision of what this food landscape can look like, but our agency to be able to do it on behalf of our communities. And so I think that blood memory has a real role. And I guess I'd love to hear Chris, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, because I know that you've been very courageous and very brave to do some calling out to entities within, the organic and regenerative ag world, to really call out the continued centering of white, cis, hetero, male thought leadership in those platforms and in those arenas. And I guess I'm just kind of curious, because I have my own thoughts around what kind of blood memory is carried in on the legacy of the settler colonial mindset and experience, and like how does that blood memory of imperialism and feudalism and the inequities that come with those class structures, how does that continue to show up even today in organic agriculture?
Oh yeah, it's great. I thank you for calling me brave, but honestly, I'm probably just foolhardy and stupid and don't know when to shut up. Blood memory for our guests who won't clean up after themselves. European kingdoms prior to contact were driven by this just constant expanding cycle of debt, war, debt, war, debt. And eventually that cycle found its way to the New World. Everything was all about some European prince or some European king funded a coup or funded a war, and they went to the Italians to get funded by it, and then somehow they had to pay these guys back, and the way you paid them back was more war, more frontiers, more extraction, more places to just dig natural resources out of the world, whether it was gold, whether it was iron ore, whether it was silver, slaves, sugar, like whatever it was always expand, 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 expand. It was always about output. It was always about debt. And it was about this toxic, perpetual growth. And Europeans came here explicitly for those frontiers to exploit so that they could finance competition between empires. That's why they showed up. That's why the people who were in charge showed up. This was always a place to be extracted from. If you're a European king, colonies are just something that you have in your portfolio, just like somebody today might have like some McDonald's stock or something, or like Facebook stock in their stock portfolio. And they had about the same level of care and interest in the landscape. You know, people own McDonald's landscape. They don't care like if the McDonald's that they're investing in is built like, you know, according to building codes, or if the employees are safe or happy or whatever. You know, all they care about is the yield and the margin, and is the price of that stock growing. And land, which we consider sacred, which we consider the blood and bones of our ancestors, which we've been sitting on for, according to the latest iteration of science, 15,000 or more years, to them, this was just another piece in their portfolio so they could fight that prince or that prince or that prince and stay rich. There was never any sense of relationship to the land, the water, the plants, the animals, except one of ownership, profit, and extraction. For regular ass white people, that relationship never existed either. For the people that came here, whether it was in the 17th century or whether it was in the 20th century, they were running from something. They were running from prison, famine, religious persecution, you know, all kinds of crap that was happening over in Europe as a result of their kind of blood memory and their legacy brought them here. And they came here with the agricultural ethics that were straight out of feudalism. You know, the idea was to produce crops that could be turned into money. You know, in Europe, if you were a peasant, if you were a serf, if you were whatever, like, you know, you got to keep like a little bit of rye and barley and whatever unspiced crap that you grew or whatever, but the rest of it went to your noble lord so that he could then send that to his noble lord, and up and up and up the chain. And it was all about money, all about empire. It was never about feeding communities. It was never about taking care of one another. It was never about any of that. And you can see that in the way that this landscape was used by non-Indigenous people when they got here, with the plantation system that started with tobacco and sugar and things like exotic things to ship back to European markets. And then that morphs into cotton and corn and rice, other things that are easily turned into money in domestic markets and foreign markets. And then eventually we wound up with king corn and like friggin' Prince soybean or whatever the heck you want to call it, which becomes the underlying basis for over-reliance on animal agriculture, bioplastics, biofuels, agricultural dumping, you know, crashing markets in Asia and Africa, you know, all that stuff. And even now, in the supposedly, you know, white-centric ideas around sustainability, like regenerative agriculture, you've got the same thing, this output-focused thing centered on like grass-fed meat or with plant-based diets. The idea of redirecting existing surpluses of cereal crops like soybeans and like corn, once again, into just more products. Everything in that blood memory is about the output. Nothing is about the health of the relationship between the manifold parts of the natural world, of which humans are an equal part. It's a capitalistic system that's predicated on market-based solutions to increasingly severe and chronic problems that the system introduces itself. It's a toxic, perpetual motion device, and it's bound to collapse because sooner or later, you know, the world is finite. You know, that's physics. You're eventually going to run out of stuff to exploit, and then that's the end. And so, kind of the way I want to dive into this next is just a question for you, Rowen, is how does our blood memory and practice of tribe, village, clan, family, indigenous relational foodways, and indigenous economics, like kin-centric economics, allow us to dream into what comes after the fall of extractive, exploitive capitalism that's endemic in the current food system? And what are some examples of how we're building this into our current projects, like what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think as a wise mentor and elder of mine, Martin Prechtel says, when production sets in, the agreement, meaning like the agreement that we as Indigenous peoples have with our food, with the land, with all our relations, instantly begins to fade. And he speaks about this in this beautiful treatise called The Unlikely Peace at Cuchamaquik, The Parallel Lives of People and Plants Keeping the Seeds Alive. And he speaks again of a time when, and we know this through conversations with our elders, through really leaning deeper into that blood memory, is that real Indigenous farming, which has been offcast as like primitive or low tech, or in all these other ways that's been put down in this lens of imposed shame by the imperial and settler colonial forces. This kind of food landscape, I cringe even to use the word food system. I'm always trying to figure out a new lexicon for trying to figure out what exactly it is, a relational food landscape or a concentric food landscape, is that this can only make food and health. He says it's real Indigenous farming cannot make money. It can only make food and nourishment and perpetuate us in this beautiful reciprocal relationship that we have to our to the relatives that are all around us, right? And so as soon as that production output mentality begins to come in, which is why the colonial project used that as a tool, right? Was used, like my great-grandfather was a farmer, right? And through the land-grant university system and the ways in which that system tried to educate the Indian out of him, right? And to make him, instead of planting corn and beans and squash in this beautiful, Three Sisters kind of way of growing, he was to grow oats and milk cows and do things in a more, kind of quote unquote civilized fashion. But what we know is that the Indigenous economics, where the ways in which we trade, bartered, restored the ways in which we moved in kinship routes upon the land through our trade routes, there was a vital and beautiful Indigenous economy that was rooted in principles of abundance, which is the actual sort of germ at the center, the living, breathing being at the center of all life, which is that life is inherently abundant, right? Like we know that as a seed keeper, I know that, I have a corn in my hand here and one seed turns into 100 and then that 100 turns into 1,000. She, that life-giving force that moves through all of us, that grew us in our mother's womb and that swells the corns inside of their husks and pods, she's inherently generous and abundant, and that is upon which our Indigenous economic systems were based on. They were based and rooted in that abundance, whereas the current capitalist system is rooted in a manufactured scarcity, right? So there's always this pooling and hoarding of resources top down. And so, I've been in conversations with brilliant minds, like one of our Mohawk elders and scholars, Mike Myers. He talks about sort of the economy of the village and in our Haudenosaunee village, where, the woman kind of controlled what was inside the clearing, where the gardens were being grown and the plants were being tended, in these agreements that we have with our cultivated plant kin, and the men were kind of in the forest and outside of there, and there was this beautiful egalitarian economy. Again, I'm not trying to, go into the trope of sort of noble savage and that there was, no challenges and that it was just a complete utopia, but there was this understanding of this balance. And I do think that as we move forward in reimagining what are the structures that can support this coming back to life and being revitalized, it cannot be through the single family, the nuclear family, the small holding agriculture. It cannot be through these structures that were perpetuated through like the Homestead Act, the Dawes Act, which was like this 40 acres and a mule, and that every family to themselves, and this sort of cutting off of connection and family and village, and was just continuing to reinforce this idea of the nuclear family, which again is that deep, long blood memory of of an extractive way of living. But we move back into more of a cooperative, village clan-based way of growing and feeding ourselves. And so through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance and the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, one way in which we're sort of bringing this back, to life, and there are many ways in which we work with a lot of community partners who are doing this, is working within a cooperative structure. So we're imagining what does an intertribal kinship-based regional seed hub look like. Sometimes we forget that, so many of us who are alive today are used to buying seeds from a seed catalog, and Indigenous peoples never commodified our seed relatives in that way. They were a gift from the earth and from the plants herself, and that there was always enough to go around, and there were these beautiful kinship trade routes that existed. And so we're revitalizing a cooperative regional seed hub based on those values and those ideas, and rooted again in those cultural values. It bears repeating again that 200 years ago, there were no such thing as a seed company, right? Like, so many people, I think you and I talked about this when we chatted before here, is like, so many people can imagine the end of the world before they can imagine the end of capitalism, right? And so many people can't even imagine a food landscape where there aren't seed companies, where you don't outsource that or abdicate that relationship to somebody else. And so we are, again, leaning into that time-honored blood memory with the community partners we work with, and building a regional seed hub that is a reflection of our cultural values and that honors the relationships and agreements that we have to our plant relatives who we descend from and who we belong to. And I think that the antidote and the medicine for the disconnection of this time is finding our way home through these foods, and it's one way is finding our way home through food and seed, but doing it as a collective love poem and a collective action. It is the way in which we move through our collective grief of the atrocities that have been done to us over the last 400 years. So that's my vision of that. And I'm just wondering, Chris, from you, is that, so often Indigenous foodways are dismissed as impractical or non-applicable to the modern world and modern food needs. They're too primitive, they don't scale, yet most of what we regard as sustainable in agriculture, even in conventional agriculture, is derived from Indigenous technology. And so I'm just wondering if you want to riff on, in practical terms, how Indigenous management is applicable today, and perhaps even through your own, cooperative farming endeavors.
Yeah, I can riff, bro. Yeah, ag Twitter is a horrible place to visit if you want to talk about Indigenous tech, whether it's North American Indigenous tech or Africa or Asia or Australia, anywhere. Yeah, first thing you're going to hear is that you're going to get the noble savage thing, like we were living in caves with, like, I don't know, with our heads stuck up our asses, and that we've got nothing to teach anybody today, despite the fact that just about everything you can think of that white folks, whether it's, like I said, conventional agriculture or sustainable regenerative agriculture or whatever, everything they're putting forward as environmentally friendly farming is derived in some way or another from Indigenous practices in one hemisphere or another. If you look at conventional agriculture, what do you got? You got no-till is basically ours. Contour planting is ours. Riparian buffers are ours. Most forestry techniques like ICO forestry, things like that, that's ours, dude. Catch cropping, cover cropping, intercropping, like all that stuff is stuff that we were doing, and then we're shipped off to residential schools to teach us not to do it. And then, Sylvanaqua blows up the world, and then, oh, look what we've rediscovered. And so you find the exact same thing happening in, like, God help us, permaculture, like key lining, zone-based agriculture, rotational grazing, composting, multi-story agriculture, food forest, biochar, controlled burns, foraging, all of that stuff is ours. It's our birthright, it's our legacy, and it's being just so aggressively appropriated. Like, these are things we were doing that Europeans are now taking as something they discovered. Happy freaking Columbus Day, again. this is how you wind up with Kiss the Ground, for example, showing all these technologies in a big old grid. And somehow all those things that I just mentioned are separate and apart from one little square that says Indigenous landscape management. Like all that other stuff, y'all didn't just like yank it from us while Alan Savory was like out in Rhodesian Civil War hunting Black people, or while, what's his name, Bill Mollison or whatever the heck his name is out in Australia, you know, with his foot up the ass of every Aborigine he can get his foot in. Like, come on, like spare me the bullshit, right? So it's like, even when they're borrowing our cultures, even when they know they're borrowing our cultures to try and save agriculture, there's this assumption that white people need to be in charge and that everyone else needs to be in the margins in a supporting role. The problem is you can't just indigenize the agriculture part and expect things to work out. It's kind of like, I don't know if anybody here watches Boardwalk Empire, but there's this one scene where Jimmy Darmody tells Nucky Thompson, you can't be half a gangster. You either got to be all the way in or all the way out. It's kind of the same thing. If you're going to borrow our tech, our techniques and stuff like that, you can't just take the tools and then put them at the service of a fundamentally extractive FU to Mother Nature kind of Eurocentric viewpoint or this white ethnocentric viewpoint. It's just not going to work when you use our stuff to eventually make it all about money. If you don't fundamentally change your worldview, the way you look at nature, if you don't change the whys rather than just the hows of producing food and protecting the environment, you are wasting everybody's time. And that's why you need Indigenous people sharing the center and not just off to the margins, because white folks can copy our tech all they want. They can copy our methods all they want. And they can, you know, they can supplement it with steel and diesel engines or whatever to make it more powerful and more scalable, whatever. Like, knock yourselves out, but you cannot copy our blood memory. You can't copy our whys of the way we relate to the world and to our kin in the way that we do. And I think that jumps like right into our next question, which is, what are the ways that we can support and center BIPOC voices and leadership to engage growing this relational food landscape and getting our blood memory applied to the way that more and more of these landscapes in this country that need us are managed?
Yeah, I think this is one for both of us, Chris, but I think I can at least start and begin to, you know, say that, again, we won't be marginalized as this continues to move forward. We acknowledge and understand tokenism and the ways in which, you know, so many times, I'm sure you've heard this enough times and I've heard it enough times, is that, you know, they want us to be the good Indians, right? The good Native peoples, the ones who, you know, show up for the heartfelt stories, but don't want to, you know, again, as, you know, whiteness always wants to center comfort, right? Not, you know, uncomfortable truths of where we've come to. And so ways in which you can give us the platform on our own terms to speak our own truths, to begin that long and hard road towards reconciliation and reparations. And I will say this is not going to be an easy process, right? This isn't going to be a comparable process, but truth-telling is at the very beginning of that process. And so creating safe spaces and brave spaces where Black, Indigenous, and people and bodies of culture can share our experiences, where we're not always fearful and guarded and armored that those things are going to be taken and appropriated and commodified and stolen from us, and, you know, Columbus from us, and all of the ways in which that happens. To be able to, for allies and accomplices to stand you know, on the outer rings and support us in our stories of resilience and beauty, as well as our rage and our grief and our anger in what has been taken from us, and allow us through this process of reclamation of tending relationships on this land and building, you know, a relational food landscape that that honors our agreements, that allows us to be trustworthy with our rage and with our grief and with all of that, and to be able to express it, and to be able, I always say this, we need to compost all of that stuff, all of the past failures, in order to create that rich and beautiful soil from which the dreams of our ancestors can sprout again. And that requires for us to have the resources. It requires us to be able to not continually do the emotional labor to negotiate and navigate our worth in places that oftentimes don't see it. And again, there's a large conversation, a national conversation, about the reckoning of the ways in which white supremacy infiltrate our everyday lives. And I have seen that more often than not in people who consider themselves progressive and liberal at organic farming conferences, where those same dynamics are so insidiously played out, where BIPOC people are continuously mined, extracted, tokenized, and asked to filter our story and our understandings through a lens of white comfort. And so I think the ways in which we can support and center is to continue to resource, is continue to, I've walked into many a boardroom that's been, white, male centered. How do we continue to, not only bring, people of color to those tables, but just remove that table and allow us to dream what that center looks like. That's not being where whiteness is centered as expert, right? That we're just sort of secondary and tertiary sort of voices in that space. And so again, a lot of us right now, we're bone tired. We've been working for decades upon the strong shoulders of our ancestors who worked against unspeakable acts to ensure that we would be alive today, and to be able to hold our seed bundles, and to be able to uphold the legacy of those agreements that our ancestors made a long time ago with our plant relatives, with the land, and all of this. And so what are the ways in which we continue to support and make it so that we don't have to sell out? We don't have to commodify our relationships to the seeds and to plants and to animals and to food, that we are supported in our lifeways by just being a seed keeper or a land steward or a land protector or a water protector, that we are supported in doing that vital work, and that we are, being not even just consulted, but being, put at that very center and given the resources to be able to dream into that future. And it's upsetting when, again, when there are countless documentaries and articles and podcasts and blogs that continue to center the same cast of characters. So y'all need to start thinking outside the box. There, Chris and I are here, but behind us and around us, there are so many humans that I wish we could invite them all here so that you could hear all their, diverse stories of resilience and the dreams and innovation and brilliance that they have for this new food future. So I don't know what other ways you want to kind of call in terms of ways that we can support. I know that in the Growing for Culture link, there's a bunch of ways you can support by Venmoing and PayPaling and donating to all the presenters that spoke today, but I think there's lots of other ways we can support if you have other ideas.
I'm sure I've got other ideas, but I'm going to just keep it short in the interest of, I do want to tell everybody we are doing a Q&A at the end of this. So if anybody has questions, put them in the YouTube chat or wherever else it might be. And I guess they're going to filter them up to us. But yeah, I mean, it boils down to give us your damn money. When I watch Gather, the first thing I see is indigenous chefs at freaking stone barns, and I'm just like, why don't we have stone barns? Why don't we get $30 million to put together like a culinary playground that we can do whatever the hell we want to do with? Why do we have to ask Dan Barber? Why do we have to ask? Why do we always have to like beg to get in the door? Why do we always have to be somebody's like charity case and the box that they check for diversity to make sure they don't get their ass lit up for being too white centric? Like, why don't we control the resources? And it's because we don't have them. That's how this country was created, by taking everything and then maybe giving us the chitlins after the Master's house was done. I'm sick of that. We need money. It's that simple. It's not very creative. It's unask your resources because you have all of them. And that's it.
Very good. So I guess I'm looking at the time here. We have about 15 more minutes. I know there's one more question I think I have that I wanted to ask you, but I also just want to ask the moderators if there are questions that they can filter up to us from participants who maybe want to jump in and talk. I mean, I know Chris and I can talk for hours and hours, but if there are, other questions that are, no questions coming in from the audience. Okay, great. Well, I'll ask this last one to Chris, and then perhaps y'all can put in your, your ideas there. So a lot of people, Indigenous and otherwise, Chris, want to return to the landscape to avert the crisis that we're currently in. And, I know you talk a lot about, and we all talk about the importance of going to the land in the right way, right? And right relationship. What is that right way to you? What does that look like? And how does it differ from mainstream notions of going back to the land? And I know this relates to a lot of things. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and I'll offer a few of mine too.
Oh yeah. I think the most important thing, if you do want to get involved in this movement, if you do want to go back to the land, quote unquote, is to go in with a mindset that you aren't running away from something, because that's how we got here. People came to this landscape with trauma in their blood, trauma in their hearts. Their hearts were breaking. They were, the average white guy that came here was terrified. This wasn't at home. They didn't want to be here. They were fleeing some kind of oppression or shitty choices of their own. So I think it's really important to recognize that when people have this idea that they're going to go back into rural areas or onto the landscape to get away from people or get away from society, get away from capitalism, get away from the system, and get away from our personal traumas. This idea that we're going to run and bring our poison with us on the landscape is not not good medicine. We need to be running toward something, toward the notion of nourishing our communities, toward the restoration of a healthy and dignified society, toward healing our relations in some part of the world, whatever that part of the world for you might be, toward looking at the world with a different kind of eye, where you see the things around you as relatives and partners and not as resources and objects. We need to go back together and not alone. We need to farm and protect the land in teams, and the bigger the team, the better, not just as individuals and nuclear families, because that was a tool of, invading the American interior, but keeping people separated enough where they could be controlled. That's the Dawes Act. That's allotments. That's bullshit. And we need to recognize that. We need to carry food from its birth as a seed to the hominy in people's stomachs, not just selling raw commodities that fetch a certain price or whatever the market may happen to bear. We need to see those relatives through their journey. And for those of us able to get on a piece of land and do our part to restore it, we need to get away from this notion that consumerism and shifting consumer attitudes are going to pull land stewards and farmers in the right direction. No matter how rich or poor you are, if you're somebody who's able to get themselves on the land and do something with it, there's a degree of privilege there. And we need to use that privilege to present people, to present those consumers, our human relations, with a compelling vision of what's possible. Because people are tired, they're sick, they're busy, they're worked to death, they're exhausted from centuries of being under the thumbs of greedy, powerful people whose goal this whole time, throughout the whole arc of quote unquote American history, has been to take everything for themselves. And we're in the final stages of that. Ultimately, we need to go back to the land with the notion that all of our relations are going to take care of one another again. And I think that's absolutely. And I think in some ways, the ways in which we, again,
apprentice ourselves and reconnect ourselves to the land and to the seeds, in the same way that our ancestors did. Again, decentering, this modern cultural insanity that we see is that, the human is so centered, and there's so many ways in which that colonial voice has continued to just, wash and seep over us, in our trauma bodies, right? And so, we often talk about, our elders say that, it's the love of our people in the earth is bigger than any like rage and hatred, than that of our oppressors. And that's what needs to move the work, that we do this work out of the love for the land and our people, as opposed to out of the hatred, for our oppressors, and then constantly in that, fight or flight and trauma mode. And we carry our nations in the same way that we carry our children, right? And we carry our seeds in that same way, and we carry our food bundles in that way, and we carry our knowledge bundles in that same way. And so if we can continue to move back, again, all of us are Indigenous to somewhere. We might have layers upon layers of trauma in our bodies that we need to work through. And that's the work of these times. I've been doing a lot of work with Res Menikin in our grandmother's hands, and doing that cultural somatics work to really understand whether we are Indigenous, Black, bodies of culture, or white bodies, where is it that trauma of disconnection lives in our bodies, and how can we do the work, even just a little bit, so that we can hand something down to our children that's a little better than when we got it, so that we can continue to, again, like you said so beautifully, move towards something, move towards that vision of healing. And there's a question that came in that I think dovetails really beautifully and nicely, which is asking about what is the Indigenous vision of reparations and what does that look like? And I, in our Indigenous food sovereignty movement, we center what we call rematriation, which is working again with finding, is reconnecting our Indigenous communities with their ancestral land that perhaps they were, ripped away from or disconnected through the displacement and relocation tools of the colonial project, and also the rematriation of seeds and those seeds coming, back home to us after a long, long time of being away. But what I will remind folks is that reparations is a multi-step journey. Many accomplices and allies want to just, cut the checks and give us the titles and deeds to land, which again, we won't deny, we will take those. But there is a multi-step journey to true reconciliation and reparations, which requires the deeper metabolization of, those past failures, so that they don't continue to sprout up again and again in this landscape and continue to perpetuate harm against BIPOC folks. I don't know if you have thoughts around reparations too, Chris?
Yeah. It's it's interesting that you mentioned like it's more than just the land, it's more than just the money, because that's absolutely correct. And one of the things that's worried me, and I don't know if we talk about this or if I talk with somebody else about this, but with kind of the weird awakening that our guests are coming to around racism in the wake of George Floyd, it's causing a lot of money and resources to go to kind of, a lot of these disparate, food farming, food sovereignty, food access type projects. And it's a really great thing to see. But there's two things that make me worried about it. I always tell budding farmers that the hardest part of farming is not going to be getting the land. It's not going to be getting the money. It's not going to be figuring out what to plant or planting it or any of that. It's going to be the business stuff, the boring stuff. Insurance is what's going to drive you out of business. It's going to be the lack of an accountant that's going to drive you out of business. It's one thing to get the land, and it's another thing to stay on it. And I think a lot of us are going into these projects without the knowledge of what it actually takes to survive economically in the system that we have to live in until we change it and until we're able to change it. I'm keeping my eye on my time. I had a white farmer friend of mine that asked, What can farmers do to help BIPOC farmers reestablish themselves on the landscape? And what can they do to kind of encourage them to work for them? And the answer really is give your knowledge for free. You'd be surprised how many farmers don't want to do that. And I think intrinsically, a lot of them know how valuable their knowledge is, because a lot of times, and especially when it comes to things like, you know, what I'm in, like livestock, that knowledge is not readily available. There isn't a lot of training for it. And the people who dominate that industry tend to be like Joel Salatin, just like explicitly racist. And you just don't want to come within, you know, like 50 feet of them. So yeah, there's more than just money you can give. You can help us know how the system works. And the reason that my organization has gotten as far as it has been because white allies have done just that. Whether it's, you know, Joel or Erica at Free Union Grass Farm, like teaching me how to butcher chickens like in a few seconds instead of a few minutes, or whether it's Sarah Mock, like showing me the deep, weird, seedy underbelly of like impact capital, or whether it's somebody like Errol Schweitzer telling me how food distribution actually works at like the Whole Foods level. Or you know, Lauren from A Growing Culture introducing me to everybody from lawyers that I'm going to need to get over things like, what the heck is it, like the accredited investor standard when I'm trying to raise money, to introducing me to one of the founders of Zingerman so I can figure out how like an actual co-op, a successful co-op can function. That expertise is hard to get for us. And Reparations is giving us that.
Well, and it's also about reclaiming our time too, because in addition to be able to apprenticing ourselves to knowledge holders of these, you know, various parts of the system, it's also the fact that we need the time and space to be able to reimagine what those systems can look like with our own agency, aligned with our own cultural values. And there is no blueprint, right? There's no blueprint of how Indigenous economics looks in the modern time, because we've never done that before, right? And so in some ways too, reparations look like giving us the space and the resources to have those, you know, to do those feasibility studies, to be in it and in prototyping and experimenting in what this can look like in this modern day, with those tools of, you know, those, you know, the tools that you're speaking of that will help us sort of navigate in this, you know, capitalist landscape, but then also the space and the, you know, I don't know if it's a luxury, but just a little bit of elbow room to be innovative, to be thinking about the ways in which we can, you know, again, improve and make those things irrelevant, right? So that, you know, we don't have to continue to perpetuate those structures that have those kind of seedy underbellies. Even though I think seeds are given a bad rap in that in that particular phrase. So it's been such a joy, Chris. I know we could just talk for hours and hours, but I just really want to just, you know, close this up by just saying that, you know, there are I think the call to action, or perhaps the invitation that's inherent in a conversation of this, is that I don't have all the answers. I'm just dreaming and imagining into, you know, what a culture of belonging can look like in our food, and what that medicine for the disconnection that we see so rampant right now, that's, you know, almost comical and cartoonish in nature in the way that it's showing up in so many places. How can we, how can each and every one of us find some way in which we are tending and cultivating relationships as it relates to the food that goes inside our bodies? Because each and every one of us is blessed by the generosity of a seed. And those seed relatives and those plant relatives and those animal relatives, they never gave up on their side of the agreement. If you have a full belly, if you ate today, if you ate yesterday, those plant relatives and those, food relatives, they never forgot you, and they never stopped upholding their side of the agreement. But it's us forgetful humans, you know, many of us by violent theft and force, and many of us by, you know, fear and fleeing. We have forgotten and we've abdicated, some of those relationships to corporations, to, grocery stores, and to all this way. And so if the invitation is to, by placing one foot in front of the other, find one way that you can continue to tend a beautiful and sacred and intimate relationship with the food that comes in, and begin to restore and rehydrate those agreements that you carry in your blood and your bones, because they're there. And they long to hear your song, and they long to hear your prayer, and they long to be in that reciprocal, reverent relationship with you again. And so that's the prayer that comes through our ancestral voices into this space right now, is that it's not too late. We have the time and capacity and resources to imagine and reimagine what that relational food landscape looks like. So I'm excited to see what comes. Hit us up on Instagram or in various platforms and let us know what you think about what a relational food landscape can look like, and the role of Black, Indigenous, and bodies of culture in the sprouting of that future of food. So thanks, Chris, for being with us.
Thank you, Rowen, and thanks everybody for listening.